The hypothesis for the study on gender identity is that gender identity is mainly impacted by nature, where gender dysphoria is mainly impacted by nurture. Throughout this presentation, I will discuss the findings of this research with you, showing you whether or not this hypothesis has been proven. When discussing topics such as gender identity, it is important to determine what a term really means. There are four terms that are the most important for this research, starting with sex, where sex is a categorization of all living things based on the biological systems and reproductive organs. Sex is often confused with gender, which really is the cultural and social aspects that are considered to being part of being male or female. So these two things are absolutely not the same. And then the difference between nature and nurture. Nature is all the biological aspects, such as biochemistry within the brain, anatomy, and physiology, where nurture is the environmental and behavioral aspects of one's life, such as upbringing, social interactions, and your environment. Sex structure determination of the brain occurs by presence or the absence of certain hormones during the brain development in the prenatal period. When testosterone and its aromatization to estradiol is present, the brain of the fetus will show to be more masculine. But when there is an absence of androgen and estrogen is present, the brain structure of the fetus will be more feminine. However, this does not mean that a brain is either completely feminine or completely masculine. There are many regions in the brain that are arranged by a certain level of estrogen and a certain level of testosterone, which results in several levels of femininity and masculinity throughout the brain. This heterogeneous composition of brain regions is present in both cisgender as well as transgender brains. Well, there is most likely a system to ensure that the sex of the brain, the overall sex of the brain, corresponds with the sex of the body in order to not jeopardize the reproduction. However, there are hypotheses trying to explain the development of non-traditional gender identity brain, stating that the alignment between the brain and reproductive organs can be inaccurate, because the development of reproductive organs is completed within the first trimester, first 3 months of the pregnancy, where the brain development continues throughout the pregnancy and even beyond. This misalignment means that the sex of the brain is not necessarily the same sex as the reproductive organs, which can result in the identification with a non-traditional gender. There are anatomical differences between the male and the female brain. When we look at the female brain, for example, we see that the hippocampus, which is the area that's used for learning and memorization, is much larger than the average male hippocampus and also works differently. Women, therefore, outperform men when it comes to remembering what an object is and where it is placed. But men outperform women in spatial memory, remembering information about one's surroundings and one's placement in those surroundings. Another example is that we see that the amygdala is larger in the male brain, as we see in the figure here. It also works differently from the amygdala in the female brain, where females recollect a stronger and more intense memory of emotional events than the men do. And then lastly, we also see that the two hemispheres of the female brain communicate much better and way more frequently than the hemispheres of the male brain, where the corpus callosum, which is a structure that connects the two hemispheres, is larger in the female brain than it is in the male brain. An incredibly interesting study performed by Savik and Lindström has recorded brain activity differences between hetero and homosexual men and women. Please note that there is a key distinction between one's sexuality and one's gender identity. However, the results of this study help support the natural impact on gender identity, as many in the LGBTQ community identify outside of the traditional gender identities. The most compelling output of this study is a compilation image of the many brain scans performed, which we see on the slide. The resulting conclusion is that the heterosexual men and homosexual women use similar parts of their brains, while heterosexual women and homosexual men utilize a consistently different part of the brain, which again shows the differences between the more feminine regions in the brain and the more masculine regions in the brain. Another explanation could be that there is a genetic component that plays a role in developing a gender identity. Research has shown that people who are related to someone who identifies with a non-traditional gender identity are more likely to identify with a non-traditional gender identity themselves compared to the average population. Inheritance is caused by a certain number of genes carrying the genetic material, and they can be either mono, poly, or oligogenic. Monogenic means that there is one single gene responsible for the trait. Polygenic means that there are many genes and environmental influences. And oligogenic means that there are a select few genes responsible for that particular trait. Identification with a non-traditional gender is most likely oligogenic and only influenced by select genes that cause genetic variances in sex hormone. And this is very interesting because this seems to show that gender identity is more nature than that it is nurture, because it is not polygenic. Gender roles are very visible when it comes to the way parents raise their children. More often than not, parents teach their children behavior that associates with their sex. Girls are told that they're cute and pretty and that they should not play too rough. Or boys are told they look smart, strong, and encouraged to go out and explore. This concept in itself is pushing children into a certain role that corresponds with their sex, creating a situation where a child feels the need to express their false gender self. It changes children and makes them to please and not stand out in their environment. Conforming to the expected norm can be very damaging for the development of a child, especially if the child grows up in an environment that's not friendly towards the LGBTQ community. When comparing a study from the Human Rights Campaign in 2018 to the data that the CDC has published on youth who have attempted suicide, we see that there is a significantly larger amount, a larger percentage of youth who have attempted suicide in the non-traditional gender identities. In that same study from the Human Rights Campaign, 24% of people who identify with a non-traditional gender feels that they can truly be themselves around their family, which is of course a very low percentage. 67% of the respondents have heard their family make negative comments about the LGBTQ community, and 70% hides their true gender to avoid harassment. These numbers make it clear that there is still a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done in our society when it comes to accepting and supporting people with non-traditional genders. Until recently, psychologists were taught that children should know their gender identity and sexual orientation around the age of 5 or 6, and if this did not happen, the child had developed a mental disorder. Even though this is no longer part of the curriculum, more often than not, parents of children who are exploring their gender are still advised by psychologists to ignore behavior that is not in line with their child's sex, and to punish the child for showing this behavior by taking away the toys and clothes that associate with the other sex. The reasoning behind this advice is that it helps the child to be accepted by his surroundings and protects them from being rejected by society. Recently, there has been heard another sound in the world of psychology where the idea is to just let the child explore the entire realm of gender identity without pushing it into a gender that might not be theirs, since they're still trying to find it, to figure it out and find who they are. So raise gender non-conforming children and give them the freedom to explore and discover without hurting them and pushing them into a role that might not be them. When someone does not identify with the gender that is associated with their sex, the psychological condition of gender dysphoria can develop. Gender dysphoria is the psychological distress caused by incongruence between their gender identity, their physical body, and their social role, which can cause severe depression and anxiety. This anxiety is caused by the difference between the first and third person perspective and which one someone decides to live by. Some people who decide to live by their first person perspective, which is the way that they feel inside, completely avoid looking into the mirror because what they see, their reflection, just increases the dissonance. Others try and live by their third person perspective, which is what they see, and use the mirror as a tool to get back to their biological sex. As one can imagine, both ways cause much harm and are not a solution to gender dysphoria. The development of one's gender identity is being influenced by nature as well as nurture. However, the initial development of gender identity takes place during the early brain development and is a biological process. This shows that the base of gender identity is predominantly influenced by nature rather than predominantly influenced by nurture. When it comes to gender dysphoria, however, we see that the majority of anxiety and depression is actually caused by the environment and their response to non-traditional gender identities, as well as the expectations from society that are embedded in these gender roles. Therefore, gender dysphoria is more related to nurture than to nature. Thank you all for watching and listening to this presentation. I hope it was helpful and interesting to you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than willing to answer those. I also wanted to thank my amazing mentor, Jay McGuire. She has helped me through it all and she's been a rock star. Even though we started this research through the early days of the pandemic and we had to adjust many times, she has been really great through it all. So a big thank you to Jay McGuire.